LGBTQ people have been in film for a long time, long before society had a chance to project stereotypes upon queer people that would later define such characters in popular media. One of the first films showing LGBTQ behavior is the Dixon experimental sound film, later known as The Gay Brothers. At the time, people were surprised not by the suggested homosexuality, but the fact that two men were dancing together at all. It was clearly not normal male behavior, but it wasn't necessarily gay, just unusual for the gender. Indeed, many of the queer-coded films of the early 20th century were less based in homosexuality as a romantic orientation, but in the idea of gender nonconformism and the comedy that inevitably ensued. In the 1914 movie A Florida Enchantment, the heroine Lillian Travers finds a magical seed that transforms the user into the opposite gender. In spirit, mind you, not physically. What follows next as Lillian slips the magical seed to others is a riot of girls dancing with girls, men dancing with men, and Lillian and her fiancé falling for each other as man and as woman, from the opposite sides of things. Gender bending was popular fodder for comedy, never taken very seriously or examined in any real depth. However, as the century wore on, attitudes regarding homosexuality became far more clear-cut and unforgiving. Gay men and women were reflected in film as sexual perverts, villains, and psychopaths. Hitchcock especially drew upon the idea of LGBTQ people as villains, despite working with many gay and bisexual writers and actors over the years. In Rebecca, the housekeeper Mrs. Danvers has an unhealthy obsession with her past employer, the late Rebecca De Winter, which results in her own demise. Strangers on a Train, based on a novel written by a gay author, shows another obsessive relationship, this time between Bruno and his object of intense affection, Guy. In Rope, two clearly homosexual lovers carry out a murder together to prove their own superiority over others. LGBTQ people seem to be portrayed as either homicidal or suicidal, clearly unbalanced one way or another. The decade after the Stonewall riots of 1969 showed a slight upswing in Hollywood attempts at showing homosexuality in a positive light, with movies such as Boys in the Band. However, in mainstream media, LGBTQ characters were still shown as dangerous or confused, either victims or aggressors, but never truly fully fleshed people. While gay acceptance, even celebration, was becoming more and more common in the music and theater scene, it had yet to truly affect Hollywood beyond a few small movies that were aimed specifically at a gay audience. The 1980s had new problems for LGBTQ people to face: a rise of right-wing religious groups protesting against LGBTQ rights. The pervasive fears of queer people could be broken down into three categories, according to a 1984 study of homophobia. 1. Homosexuality as an individual threat, that you or someone you know might be gay. 2. Homosexuality as a threat to others, as often queer people were portrayed as sexually violent. And 3. Homosexuality as a threat to the community, the idea that gay people represent the destruction of the nuclear family and traditional gender roles. Villains were still often queer-coded, making use of bisexuality as a particular method of portraying sexual deviance, such as in the movie Blue Velvet. The villain, Frank, keeps a woman prisoner for his own sexual use, but sexually assaults the male protagonist as a method of violence and intimidation. In the late 80s, the depiction of gay people turned especially tragic in the wake of the AIDS epidemic. With the tempers of the religious extremists cooling somewhat, Hollywood began to delve into the tragedy of the AIDS crisis, with movies such as Longtime Companion and Philadelphia. Homosexuality as a tolerable, even natural part of the human experience as reflected in Hollywood film is a very recent phenomenon. The 90s featured a slew of gender-bending films, with movies like Mrs. Doubtfire and The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. Still, these were not the stories of LGBTQ people as normal people, with character and plot beyond their own sexuality. Such stories would not be commonly told in film for at least another decade. While it hardly escapes the norm in terms of the tragic gay stereotype, Brokeback Mountain is notable in that an LGBTQ-centric film became popular for a general audience, not just for the LGBTQ niche. This opened the door for more films to be made for mass media, though they mostly centered around white cisgendered gay men. The history of LGBTQ people in cinema is one of much misinformation and fear, depicting queer people as dangerous deviants to stay clear of, or tragic victims of a life that could never be truly lived due to their sexuality. LGBTQ people have been dealt a short hand in terms of action roles, thriller roles, or even romantic comedy roles, genres that heterosexual cisgendered people have seen themselves reflected in with no comment passed regarding their sexuality since the birth of cinema. However, with the legalization of gay marriage in North America and worldwide, and campaigns to raise awareness and acceptance of LGBTQ people, we're starting to see proof of change. One can only hope that in future, we'll see LGBTQ people in more diverse roles more accurately portraying how LGBTQ people live in real life, like normal people.